One of the most feared fighting forces of the Second World War was the Waffen-SS, the army's combat branch of the Schutzstaffel. But there was one military unit made up of Indian soldiers that later became part of the SS, and with this the Indian Legion, a troop of around 4,500 soldiers, were actively fighting against the Allies and were fighting for Hitler and the Nazis. They were part of the German army before they were switched to the Waffen-SS, but the story of this legion is one which is shocking, but one which was deep-rooted with trying to liberate India from the British. There has been a long history in India of fighting to bring down the British Raj, and rebellions would be initiated to do this, and the Indians hoped for German support. During the Second World War, all of the major Axis powers supported armed revolutionary activities in India against the British. One man who was considered a significant threat to the British during the Second World War was Subhas Chandra Bose, a former president of the Indian National Congress. He managed to escape house arrest, and he then travelled to the Soviet Union, where he wanted aid to help and support an uprising in India. But the Soviets were concerned about going against the Allies in case of a German invasion, and Chandra Bose then went to Germany and he met with Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, and then Hitler himself. In Berlin, Bose established the Free Indian Centre and the Azad Hind Radio, which broadcasted to Indians, and he was promised support to help bring the downfall of the British, but then talk came about bringing a fighting force made up of Indian soldiers into the war who would fight for the Nazis and the Germans. The first soldiers of the Indian Legion were Indian prisoners of war captured during the battles of Tobruk, and the German forces had 27 POWs who were trained as officers, and these were sent to Berlin. Eventually, the number of Indian prisoners of war grew, and Indian soldiers were being sent back to Germany to join the Legion. Further training took place to school them in the ways of the German army, and there were 15,000 Indian POWs in Europe, and many remained loyal to the king and emperor, and treated Bose with contempt, but a number did swear allegiance and defect to the Nazis. With this, the maximum size of the Indian Legion was 4,500 men, and these were then transferred to the German military. They were schooled in stricter discipline, they were taught how to use different weapons, but they were not allowed to mix with other German soldiers at times. They did experience the same facilities and clothing and food rations as German soldiers, but they were also trained in coastal defence. The uniform of the Indian Legion was feldgrau in winter and khaki in summer, which was standard for the German army, and on the upper right arm they wore a badge designed in the shape of a shield with a leaping tiger in the middle. They also had the colours of their unit on their steel helmets at times, and Sikhs were allowed to wear a turban, which was dictated by their religion if they wanted to, rather than a peaked field cap. Subhas Chandra Bose probably never believed that the Indian Legion would be strong enough to carry out a huge offensive in India, but the Legion would be involved in a lot of action during the Second World War. Following the German defeat at Stalingrad and at El Alamein in North Africa, it was clear that an assault through Persia to India by the Axis would never occur. The Legion would be transferred to the Netherlands, and in April 1943 it was part of the Atlantic Wall, and then months later it was moved to France. It was attached to the 344th Infantry Division, then the 159th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht. More reassignment took place, and it continued to see action in France and was viewed by the locals as wild and loathsome. But then what happened was rather shocking. The Legion was based near to Bordeaux at the time of the Normandy landings, and they remained there for the next 2 months after the 6th of June 1944. They were ordered to help suppress the French resistance and to help round up and capture civilians so that these people could be used in forced labour projects for the German military. The Second World War. The unit was then renamed the Indische Freiwilligen Legion der Waffen-SS. The command of the unit was given from Obersturmbannführer Kurt Krapp to Oberführer Heinz Breitling. The Indian soldiers realised a change in command and they were not happy with the leadership, and Berling was then relieved of his duties shortly after. But the Legion's fighters would be ordered to lay their lives down for Nazi Germany and to dig in and fight as much as they could against the Allies who at this time were pushing forward heavily. They had not at this time seen much action, but they were then on the retreat back to Germany, and whilst engaging French forces in the town of Dun, the unit suffered its first combat casualties, with Lieutenant Ali Khan becoming wounded. The unit then continued to experience fighting with the enemy, and they engaged Allied tanks whilst retreating across the Loire River to Dijon. All whilst they were moving back, they were continually assaulted and attacked by the French resistance, who inflicted more casualties. They did manage to get back to Germany. However, with the defeat of Nazi Germany on the horizon in May 1945, Adolf Hitler would decide to die by his own hand inside of his bunker in Berlin. The Indian Legion realised that the war was lost, and they knew that if they were sent back to India, there was a good chance their own people would execute them, or that the British would deem them traitors and have them executed themselves. Because of this, the remaining part of the Indian SS battalion, based in Germany, travelled to neutral Switzerland to seek sanctuary. They had to try and enter Switzerland through an alpine pass, marching along the shores of Lake Constance, but their attempt to enter the country was not successful. They were captured by the American and French forces, and were then taken to the British and Indian troops who fought on the side of the Allies. It's believed that some of the Indian Legion was shot by French Moroccan officers near to Ingolstadt when they were captured before they could be sent to the British. The captured soldiers would then be sent back to India, and many were to stand trial for treason, but many of the sentences were commuted. A controversial part of their legacy is their link to Nazi Germany, and the belief that they were collaborators with the Nazis based on their uniform, their oath, and who they fought alongside of. Chandra Bose did in correspondence denounce the racist policies of the Nazis, but he did express admiration for the methods of government used by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and he would praise Mussolini and Hitler, and he believed that he could take these dictatorial principles and apply it in India. His views, though, were not always shared by the men of the Indian Legion, who were partly or in collaboration with the ideology of the Nazis. The volunteers were not just taking part in fighting with the SS and the Wehrmacht, as they wanted to escape imprisonment. A number of them were motivated by hatred of the British. Many soldiers, though, were not prepared to fight for the enemy after abandoning their oath, and it became clear that they had in a sense been betrayed. Many believed that the Nazis would help them achieve independence in India, and that they would invade the country through Persia, but it was clear that the German army had no wish to do this, and these Indian soldiers were instead just fighting on the Western Front for the Nazis, rather than their independence back home. There were elements of obstinance and refusal with the Legion also, as when they were deployed in the Netherlands, 2 companies refused to move. Some men had little loyalty to the Nazi cause and ideology. However, following their absorption into the SS, this was a fighting force which Himmler prided himself on complete ideological devotion. It's believed that the unit did take part in some war crimes, for example in the Medoc region in July 1944, and in the region of Ravec. They assaulted and even murdered children. Some who were sent to Italy also took part in anti-partisan operations, resulting in more death and execution. What is concerning, though, is their involvement with the Waffen-SS, and although they didn't have a choice in this, the SS to begin with was partially open to people of only Germanic origin. But Nazi propaganda would uphold that the Waffen-SS would fight against Bolshevism and the Jews, and of course the Waffen-SS were involved in a huge number of war crimes and atrocities, with some former members even being executed after the conflict. The fact the Indian Legion were linked to this organisation is one which is rather shocking. But the Indian Legion was a military unit that fought during the Second World War as part of the German army, and then later the Waffen-SS. They believed that they would be backed up by the Germans to help liberate British-ruled India. However, this would never be the case. They would fight alongside normal German soldiers. They had non-combat roles in the Netherlands and in France, until the Allied invasions of D-Day. They would then be used to help repel the Allied advances, and they were pitted against the French resistance fighting mostly against these. India would get independence in 1947, 2 years after the war in Europe came to an end. But in the eyes of many Indian people, the 4,500 who fought for the Nazis and the SS during World War II were traitors. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.